Good morning, everybody. I hope you can hear me. This isn't an ideal mic, and I have to sort of lean over it. There we are. So welcome, everybody. We're here today for an extremely important event. My name is Steve McGuire. I'm Dean of the Business School, for those of you who don't know me. I am simply the very brief warm-up act for a number of distinguished people today to talk about the life and contributions of Michael Lipton. So by way, I've been asked to sort of introduce the school, and I think it's an interesting sort of segue into a discussion about Michael's contributions, because those of you who suffered my introductions over the past 8 years know that I say that the business school at Sussex is a distinctively Sussex business school. It has a broader, and it has always had a broader subject base than many other business schools. It has had a clear commitment to development studies, development work than many other business schools. We have, for example, an extremely large research program across departments around food security and food poverty. And one of our research units in SPRU has just announced a major new network node for research they're doing in South Africa. And of course, the Department of Economics here has a proud and rich tradition building on Michael's work of interdisciplinarity, interest in development studies, interest in the role of public policy. So we are very much in line with and build upon the tradition that Michael represents. So with that, I'll just welcome you. Thank you all for making the time. That includes those of you online. Thank you for making the time to come today to celebrate a wonderful life and a distinguished scholar. And with that, I'll just turn over to Alan Winters to introduce the first panel. Thank you, Alan.
So thank you very much, Steve, and thank you everyone coming. 9 o'clock on Friday morning. This is a morning to celebrate Michael's life, Michael's work, and I have a distinguished panel to start the programme off, and I will introduce them just in a very few seconds. I just want to say, really, I suppose, as a member of the Department of Economics, how valuable a colleague Michael Lipton was, and inspiring. Michael could be pretty demanding at times, and I think a few people have experienced that, but he was also very generous at the other end with sort of advice and support, and acknowledging sort of where ideas came from. Michael and I didn't always see eye to eye on economic policy, and we had some pretty deep debates, but he was always polite, and he usually won them. He was just a remarkable person to be sort of informed by. And I think anyone who dealt with Michael became the richer for it. In the days when we had in-person seminars once or twice a week, even after he had retired, Michael came along to many of our seminars and was absolutely laser sharp in his comments to people. Usually very constructive, and well, always polite, usually very constructive. Just occasionally he would be irritated and take somebody apart, but one just watched this pure intellect, just the pure sort of computing power and experience that he had. So I enjoyed all my interactions with Michael, social as well as academic, and I think we were immensely privileged in Sussex to have him as one of our founding academics, and then as a colleague for nearly 50 years thereafter. In my mind, Michael was just the best example of an academic, perhaps of the old school, but just a very, very fine mind, a very fine man. And I think we owe him a huge debt. So I wasn't scheduled to say any of that. I'm now going to pass on to the job I'm supposed to do, which is to chair the panel. We have 3 speakers who are going to reflect on Michael's life here and work. First, Seb Oliver, Deputy Provost Chancellor for Research, just to comment on Michael as a member of the university in Sussex. And then Professor Mick Moore, who is the Director of the International Centre for Tax and Development in IDS, and then Richard Longhurst, a former IDS fellow and colleague of Michael, who are going to sort of walk us through the intellectual history, but also with, I guess, a few personal anecdotes, I gather. So I'm going to pass over now to Seb. So Seb, if you would.
Right. So it's a great pleasure to be able to say a few words on behalf of the university in honour of Michael Lipton. Sadly, I didn't know Michael myself very well. However, from what I've heard, his career captures the spirit and the values of the University of Sussex. Michael, as we've heard, has been associated with Sussex for 60 years. He was one of the founding members of faculty at the opening of the university in 1961. Now, folklore has it that in the early days, Sussex was nicknamed Balliol by the Sea. I guess some of you might be able to confirm that. Due to, I think, its liberal values and the observation that many of the founding faculty came from, and perhaps you might say liberated from, the University of Oxford. Michael himself did study at Balliol College and then also at MIT, and he was also a fellow at All Souls College, Oxford. At Sussex he was initially a lecturer and was then promoted to reader. And then in 1967 he moved all the way over to our partners at the Institute of Development Studies as a fellow and then as a professorial fellow. But he moved on to do active things, creating real-world impact, and spent a period with the World Bank in Washington DC and as an advisor to the government of Botswana and I believe others. In 1994 he returned to the university as a professor of development economics and founded here the Poverty Research Unit in what was then the School of African and Asian Studies, where he was a research professor until 2016 and then emeritus professor in the Department of Economics. Now, as Alan was saying, Sussex is known for its interdisciplinarity, and Michael was a pioneer of interdisciplinary research at a time when academic discourse was heavily dominated by strict disciplinary divides, so really pushing that whole concept of interdisciplinarity, which of course is now something that's kind of adopted in many places. So I get the sense that Michael's research and advocacy of interdisciplinary methods was driven by a passion to tackle important challenges and thus encapsulates the Sussex spirit recently articulated as a better university for a better world. Michael cared passionately about the poor in developing countries and dedicated his life to understanding the economics of poverty. His many contributions around the notion of optimising poor, introducing a fieldwork to the study of economics of poverty, the study of green revolution and food security in Asia and Africa were all pioneering and path-breaking. We're very proud of the reputation we have at Sussex for international development in partnership with the Institute of Development Studies, where we've recently been ranked #1 in the world for the 7th year in a row. And Michael, I think, has made a huge contribution to this and made Sussex distinctive for what it is today in the fields of international development and development economics. Of course, as a university, you'd expect us to be proud of our academics, but Michael's contributions have been widely recognised by many others. He was elected a Fellow of the British Academy in 2006 and received the 2012 Leontief Prize. He was appointed Companion Order of St Michael and St George, CMG, for his contributions to international development in 2003. I'm thus delighted that we've included this conference in his honour as part of the celebratory festival of the Summer of Research. Thank you.
Good morning. I can confirm that Sussex was known as Balliol by the Sea, but only briefly, unfortunately. Quite a number of those people from Oxbridge who came down in the early 60s spent a year or two here and went back, and Michael was actually rather an exception, I think, in that he did spend the rest of his career here. I should explain, I started my career here also several centuries ago as Michael's research assistant, and later he was my doctoral supervisor. I want to talk this morning about a book, Why Poor People Stay Poor, Urban Bias in World Development, published in 1977, and this was the major single product of the first part of Michael's career. And let me just explain briefly why I think this was so significant. If we go back to the sort of intellectual environment in development studies in 1960s and in 1970s when this book was written, the dominant, there was almost a consensus that the mission for economic development was for governments to move resources from agriculture into manufacturing industry. That's dominantly what development was thought to be. And just, I mentioned, by the way, that services at that point were thought to be sort of really quite irrelevant, and quite a few people, Marxists and others, described services as just unproductive. So it was a very different world that we were talking about in the world today. So there was a pretty broad consensus on that. That view came particularly strongly from many people on the Marxist left, and it's worth mentioning that Sussex was strongly influenced in social sciences and elsewhere by Marxism, to the extent that at some point in the 1970s there was a serious proposal to create a school of Marxist studies at the University of Sussex. And many people commented that we were really lucky that we didn't follow that up, because Margaret Thatcher came a little later. Anyway, the Marxists were particularly keen on rapid industrialization, still, I think, having a rather favorable impression of forced industrialization in the Soviet Union in the 1930s. And adding to the consensus, the idea that not only would agriculture have in some sense to be sacrificed, but agriculture should also become capitalist as quickly as possible. And there was a little bit of, I think in retrospect, slightly unpleasant relish in the idea that the peasantry was somehow the doomed class of history, and capitalism was going to roll over them and get used to the idea. Anyone who questioned that was called a populist. Well, populist meant basically a wimp. You couldn't kind of face the realities of life, and Michael was often called a populist because he really centrally confronted that idea. But he confronted it by looking at what was happening in the Third World in terms of economic policy, and actually found that what was happening was not totally different from what we were telling the Third World should happen, but what was happening was a set of policies that were, on the whole, rather haphazard and unconstructive, and not likely to achieve development. On the one side, certainly there was promotion of industry, but often with no kind of intellectual framework in the current day of ideas of industrial policy, but basically industrialization, we need a steel plant, we need a cement plant, etc. But on the other side, and this is where Michael's contribution came, was looking at what was actually happening to agriculture. And urban bias was the idea that agriculture was being consistently squeezed in an inefficient and unfair way. Two major dimensions of that. On the one hand, governments were extracting surpluses from agriculture, especially agricultural commodity exports, and shifting them to urban areas, doing this through overvalued exchange rates and through a great deal of state forcible marketing to state monopolies. But secondly, Michael was looking at the patterns of public investment and showing that they were biased in various kinds of ways towards towns. So that, in a nutshell, is what urban bias is about. It is a very long book. It's more than 467 pages. And certainly it's a work of a great intellect, but it's also a work of someone who put enormous effort. And let me just mention at that point, back in the 1960s and 70s, the world was so data and information poor compared to today that anyone who set out to write a book about economic policies in what was then called the Third World was faced a major challenge of getting information research on anything. So this was a great achievement. I can summarize the argument of the book in the first few sentences. The most important class conflict in the poor countries of the world today is not between labour and capital, nor is it between foreign and national interests. It's between the rural classes and the urban classes. The rural sector contains most of the poverty and most of the low-cost sources of potential advance, but the urban sector contains most of the articulateness, organisation and power. Michael wasn't actually the first person to pick up these broad ideas, but he was certainly the first person to give them a clear name and to promote that argument as enthusiastically and clearly as he did. I think he was broadly right about the policy biases. It's very hard to know, but the book received a great deal of favourable attention. He was right about that. He was certainly very right and very good about the political messaging. As you see from the opening chapter, this is someone who wants to influence the world, not to impress other academics. And he was very good at using very shorthands like urban bias is unfair and inefficient. It doesn't get simpler than that. He was, I'm a political scientist I should say, he was a little wobbly on his political analysis here. Partly because he was in this Marxist influence environment. He picked up this idea that somehow politics was about two big contending forces. But it's not capital and labour or domestic and foreign interests, but it is urban classes and rural classes. Great image, but it doesn't stand up terribly well to scrutiny. And most obviously because at the time when people challenged Michael and said, but there are a lot of poor people in urban areas and there are rich people in rural areas. And Michael's answer was, yeah, but rich people in rural areas are really urban and poor people in urban areas are really rural because they're migrants. And there are other slightly more sophisticated critiques you could make. There was no real sense of the variety of lobby groups that were actually involved in creating these policies that Michael talked about. And I should also say that he never really addressed the sort of more fundamental question, but why is it that urban bias is so prevalent in low-income countries today? I mean, what is it about the world? I think there is an answer to that, but it's a very long one and I'm not going to give it. So, I think this is a great achievement. If you look at it, people who look at it today will find it a little bit sort of antiquated in a sense because there were virtually no data sets. So Michael is not testing general propositions about a large number of countries in the world in terms of data sets on those countries. He is almost literally sometimes scouring for research and then finding a little bit of research on a question in Peru and kind of assuming, well, if it's true in Peru, it's probably also true in Thailand. But he can be excused that because we did not have the information. So it was a great achievement for its time. It will not be read very widely in future. I want to conclude by saying that of the many things positive things one might say about Michael, I personally would never say that he was an expert. And the reason I say that is not because he wasn't terribly good, but in addition to being a great economist, Michael was a polymath in many areas, including chess, and he had a great way with and love of words. And one of the first things I learned from Michael was the definition of an expert. And an expert is, an X is a has-been, and a spurt is a drip under pressure. And if we don't remember a lot of the argument from urban bias. I do think we should hang on to that definition of an expert. Thank you.
Good morning, everybody. First of all, the first thing I have to do is to convince you that it's more by accident than design that I take as my starting point and subject to my discussion of working with Michael, a comment made in his tributes on the IDS website by our distinguished speaker today, Sir Tim Besley. And this comment was, I benefited greatly from Michael's many insights as well as encouragement when I worked on what were considered to be offbeat topics among economists. Well, my offbeat topic, working with Michael, was nutrition. The topic of my dissertation, which he supervised, the book on Green Revolution, New Seeds and Poor People, and research assistance for some papers with the World Bank and IFPRI, the International Food Policy Research Institute. Michael's role in all of these pieces was far more than he acknowledged. Another facet of his way of working, which was mentioned in the tributes. I first met Michael when IDS was in Stanmer House in 1968 as an undergraduate and about to embark on a study trip to India. My tutor at Y College suggested I might talk to him. He'd been on the radio, I remember, the Home Service, those of you who remember that, talking about his field work in Kavathay village in Maharashtra a couple of years previously, and he discussed with me the principles of rationality among the rural poor. I could scarcely believe that an eminent academic would spare such time for an undergraduate, but this was something I saw many times during our long collaboration. I had an interest in nutrition and child malnutrition. I don't quite know why, perhaps a result of ignorance and idealism together, but he took me very seriously and said he would supervise me if I wanted to come to Sussex for a DPhil on nutrition registered in economics. So I turned up at Sussex 5 years later for a doctorate with Michael and Jeff Heal as supervisors. Now, I wasn't totally clueless, as in the interim I studied for a master's degree at Cornell University in development economics, supervised by Professor David Paul, a professor of food economics who had a joint appointment between agricultural economics and the Graduate School of Nutrition. Professor Call had pulled together a group of master's and doctoral students to work on the expanding food assistance programs in the US. And yes, as master's research, I did a cost-benefit analysis of food programs. At the time, nutrition by economists was being argued as important in efficiency terms, which is that it will contribute to human productivity and GDP, and so pay for itself many times over. When I arrived at IDS, Michael was already deep in nutrition with the Village Studies programme, of which of course Mick was part, overseeing the work of Sue Schofield on the seasonality of nutrition, among many other aspects. The Village Studies programme examined village-level variance on the causality of migration, labour use, as well as nutrition. Sue's article in the Journal of Development Studies in 1974 on seasonality and nutrition and its programming implications remains a true classic and a foundation for later work at IDS. Michael and I agreed that I would turn my attention to a village study looking at the dynamics of production and consumption of allocation of calories in households. He also told me that he expected me to be resident in a village for at least one crop cycle of 12 months, speak the local language, and carry out my interviews when most convenient to farmers, which was usually early in the morning or late at night. My reaction was, oh my goodness. I'd seen PhD field workers nip in and out, but this was much more serious. But this was the research ethics of the day, and for more information, see the classic publication, IDS Discussion Paper number 10, Methodology of Village Studies, by Lipton and Moore, 1970. However, having achieved all of these fieldwork goals when I returned from northern Nigeria in triumph, after nearly 2 years and a suitcase full of completed questionnaires with associated scribbles, Michael asked me what was my central argument and what were the expected results. So I said, how can I know that when I've not done any data analysis yet? No doubt with an eye on the level of significance, perhaps, at the 0.05 level of my independent variables. And he said, well, you're not much good. After all that time in the field talking to rural families, you can't tell me what you found out. So I took a deep breath and rolled off my central argument, what I predicted would be the results. This proved true, but with multiple caveats. Apparently, reality is a central argument, proved or disproved, with multiple caveats. And my work on the intra and inter-household distribution of resources and nutritional consequences, and I drew heavily on the growing interest in household economics, as promoted by the late Bob Evanson of Yale. And Michael encouraged me to examine the microeconomics of nutrition, looking at the terms of trade of calories, using calories as a numeraire traded within and outside of a household. We tried to show that terms of trade were worse for the poorer rural households. Now, through this period of doctoral supervision, it was clear that I exasperated Michael with my slow-moving brain. Interactions with him were exhausting as he tried to drive me towards higher standards of clarity and argument. He left you with no place to hide because he wanted to engage in vigorous debate. In the office, this was hopeless. Because if I failed to respond quickly to his questions, he'd look out the window, pick a book off his shelf, or even make a phone call to a colleague. But then there was a magnificent breakthrough in collaboration. His doctor told him he to exercise more, and so he took up running, which he enjoyed beyond words. So I was a runner, and we often ran together in Stanmer Park with IDS colleagues, and on Sundays from his house in Kent Town to Rottingdean and back. This made our discussion much easier, as between heavy breaths I could mull over his comments for a few moments, at least before replying. And I became more confident at answering him back, so our collaboration became more effective. This paid off as close as submission date, he said. Yes, I have noticed your drafts have improved. And the supervisory aspect was interlaced with reams of knowledge about literature, food, wine, history, music, current affairs, geography and humour, and kindness and hospitality from himself and Moe. I not only acquired a new running partner, but an expert on the human physiology of exercise. Towards the end of my time as a doctoral student, a length of time that would never be tolerated today, I worked with Michael as a research assistant on the topic of ultra-poverty, immediately prior to his secondment to the World Bank as senior economic advisor. His argument was to draw attention to what he called the ultra-poor, which were households with so little income per consumption unit that if they adopted spending patterns typical of their household size, consumption and income, they would eat so little food as to be a significant risk of not meeting dietary energy requirements. The ultra-poor came under the 80% rule. That is, the proportion of those eating below 80% of their dietary energy requirement despite spending at least 80% of income on food. And these groups suffer a level of undernourishment that leads to functional impairment. For most low-income countries, about 10 to 20% of people fall into these ultra-poor groups, although seasonally this may be much higher. His work on ultra-poverty was published in the World Bank Staff Working Paper 597 and relied on the existence of large data sets on production and consumption, both calorie and cash expenditure on food. He used two data sets in particular from semi-arid areas, one from the village studies days in northwest India and one set from the Rural Economy Research Unit at Ahmadu Bello University in Zaria, northern Nigeria, where I've been based for my work. And finally, I wanted to mention his research when seconded to the head of the Food Consumption and Nutrition Division of IFPRI, published in '94. This concerned adaptation to dietary energy stress. As any human physiologist in the audience will know, as well as those of us on continual diets, a reduction in energy intake leads to a number of adaptations, including reducing requirements. This can be controversial literature, perhaps suggesting, well, the poor are adapting and coping with stress, so that's all right then. Michael, of course, never took that view in his work on rational behaviour. Among the poor, saying once, I remember, just because the poor are coping with stress and allocating their resources efficiently, but doing so with one hand tied behind their back doesn't mean you don't untie the hand. And Michael's research in this area with Philip Payne, the London School of Tropical Medicine, reviewed all this relevant literature. So these are 4 areas of Michael's research in the nutrition area with which I'm familiar. Seasonality, terms of trade within and between households, ultra-poverty, and adaptation. He was pushing the role of research and economists into nutrition, physiology, and behavioural response, and within families. Of course, like all of us, he argues for more research, hands up of those who've done that. But his work was a deeper dive, more attention to the granularity, and greater treatment and reworking of data used for different means across disciplines, and acute identification of gaps. I do realise that the interest in nutrition by economists, although growing slowly from the 1980s, has grown exponentially since about 2005, including work by some people in the economics department here at Sussex. Now, I kept up with the literature until about the mid-90s, but do not have an understanding of the whole picture since then, so I'll not pontificate about that. So there's Michael's sense of rigour, dislike of sloppy work, from whoever that was, whatever their seniority, has been mentioned in the many tributes made. He boned up on the work of nutritionists and health professionals and met them on their own terms, not always, of course, with fulsome praise for their work. His work on nutrition grew out of this early field work in Kelapay village in India, which started with the view that poor rural families behave rationally in response to risk and uncertainty. Well, if now I'm going to encourage you to read one of many articles of Michael's on nutrition, it will be where he combined his work on seasonality and ultra-poverty in the IDS Bulletin on Seasonality in 1986. 4 pages plus references, which Michael concludes are admittedly scrappy thoughts of a dry brain in a dry season. And building other linkages between these and other areas of work would still be very profitable. And let me say in passing how much so many of us have benefited from having the IDS Bulletin as an outlet where we can be refereed and publish slightly non-traditional pieces on development. To wrap up, I just wanted to mention some of the work Michael did on agricultural research, as shown in the book on new seeds, and his consultancies with the CGIR, Consultative Group on Agricultural Research. Again, helped by the work of the late Bob Evanson about the high returns to agricultural research. With one such consultancy, he made a presentation to heads of centres at a meeting in London. He presented a paper on a framework with which to make choices for investment in different types of crops: nutritional value, productivity, contribution to reducing poverty, and likely risks and uncertainty in the research process. I'm afraid, having searched hard for the paper, I cannot find it on the system, so please take my word for this. I remember that one of the CG bigwigs kindly, but rather firmly dismissed this along the lines of, "You academics are all the same. Heads always heads in the cloud. I have 30 years of experience and I rely on my judgment, not on some academic framework." Michael replied, "But when you wake up in the morning and swing your legs out of bed," and I thought, oh no, where's he going with this? You are subconsciously making his decisions anyway. What is the basis of this? It's our academics, rather than here, job to help you make the basis for your decisions made by judgment more explicit to all parties. And I think as this thought applies to all of us, I'd like to close there.